Hello fellow readers and readresses. What is this? Why is this always happening? November was a very interesting reading month. I had 11 books on my TBR, of which I read 7, DNF'd 1, and I'm currently still reading 3. On top of that, I read a few books that weren't even on my TBR, so overall I did quite well. Though I wouldn't call this my best reading month because I didn't enjoy quite a bit of the books, I think. Or at least that's my impression thinking back on it. As always, today we're gonna go through all the books that I read in November in the order in which I picked them up. But before we do that, let's look at the books that were actually on my TBR. First we had Without a Fail by Lee Child, which was selected by the prompt cards, and the prompt was to read a book that was set in a place I want to visit. I used US for that place because I live in Europe and I've never traveled out of the continent. Then we had Abaddon's Gate by James S. A. Corey, which was for science fiction. Then we had The Big Four by Agatha Christie, which was for mystery/thriller. Next was Fullmetal Alchemist Volume 6 by Hiromu Arakawa, which was for manga. East of the West by Miroslav Penkov, which was a 2023 TBR jar pick. Pachinko by Jin Lee, which was for historical fiction. The Atlas 6 by Olivie Blake, which was from the prompt cards, and the prompt was to read a book from an author you read from before and disliked. Immortal Longings by Gong, which was for an internet famous author. I think this was another prompt card. The Dragon's Legacy by Deborah A. Wolf. This book was for the Dragon Readathon I'm participating in, which was created by Ash from Books to Ashes. I'm gonna link her channel in the video description. The Subtle Art of Not Giving an F, the unconventional guide for living a good life or something like that. It's a very long title. I couldn't fit it all in my reading journal, and this book was for the Buzzword Reading Challenge, where the word for November was good, and True Betrayals by Nora Roberts, which was for the Adventure in Eldia Reading Challenge, where the prompt for November was Random Number Generator. Now, time to go through the books. First was The Big Four by Agatha Christie. This is an adult mystery and the 5th book in the Hercule Poirot series. I love this series. It's one of my favorite ones. This book was very short and I read it within a day. I love this book and I gave it 5 stars. What I liked the most was the enormous scale on which the plot was set up, and thanks to the ambiguous ending, I am expecting to see more of this storyline in later books. There were so many twists and turns, so many both expected and unexpected things happened. It was lovely. I highly recommend this series, and I think what I'm gonna do is go back and start reading the books in the order in which they were published, because there might be an overarching plot that I don't want to miss. Great read, very happy with it. The second book was not so great, and that was Immortal Longings by Gong, which is an adult dystopian urban fantasy romance, and the first book in the Flesh and False God series. I have a full review of this book which you can watch over here, so I'm not gonna talk too much about it. I didn't like it, I gave it 2 stars. I wouldn't say that I'm surprised. This is definitely not something that was written for me, but even by those standards, I think it fell short. Very beautiful edition of the book though. Book number 3 was Without a Fail by Lee Child. This is an adult thriller and book number 6 in the Jack Reacher series, and this was another fantastic entry in one of my favorite series ever written. We get a little bit more of Jack Reacher's backstory and a super exciting and mysterious plot, which was revealed in one of the most masterful ways. Honestly, I was on the edge of my seat for like 90% of this book, and if I didn't have an adult's responsibilities, I would have probably read the whole thing within 24 hours. The book also delivered in terms of tough emotional moments, and it humanized our rather stoic main character slightly more. This is probably my favorite entry in the series so far, but just be warned that I say that about every single book of this series. Highly recommend. Next we had another favorite of mine, and that is Fullmetal Alchemist Volume 6. I'm not gonna say too much about it. This is my favorite manga series, although as I always mention, I haven't read that many. This follows the story of 2 young brothers who lose their mom, and whilst trying to bring her back to life with alchemy, one of them loses an arm and a leg, and the other one his entire body. And so now they go around, they learn things, and they're trying to find a way to restore their bodies. This is a lovely series set in a lovely world with lovely, amazing characters. I absolutely loved it. This dived into their backstory and it was absolutely amazing. Very emotional, very lovely. I'm super excited to continue with the series. Matter of fact, well, I'll talk about this later. Obviously, I gave it 5 stars. Next, we have a book that I feel very conflicted about, and that is Pachinko by Jin Lee. This is an adult historical fiction and is one of the favorite books of a friend of mine who highly recommended it to me, and I really wanted to love it, but I didn't. And there are a few reasons for it, and I'm gonna try to explain them here in a cohesive way. Now, before I do that, I would like to say that I gave this book 3 stars, and it wasn't all bad. For example, I found the historical components of this story, of which there are many, quite fascinating. There is so much I didn't know and managed to learn from this book. It sparked interest to explore the history of Korea and Japan more deeply, and for that I have to give it praise. I would also like to highlight the beginning of the book. Both the plot and the characters of the first third were fascinating and I ate it up greedily. But this is where my praise ends. To begin with, the book is too long, and that comes from a person that prefers longer books. For one, the pacing of this book is completely out of balance. We would spend a ton of time on some minute detail of day-to-day life, which, whilst interesting on its own, was ultimately irrelevant to the story and as such slowed the pace to glacial levels. As a contrast, we would barely brush over massive world-shattering events. For example, she would spend pages upon pages on the minutiae of cooking, but somebody's death would be represented with one single sentence at the end of the chapter, something like, "and then he died," no preamble or anything, or with a single sentence in the beginning of the next chapter, "after his death," again, nothing before that. And it just felt like the author had no idea why we're here. Secondly, we follow way too many characters. We follow fully 2 generations of people and then 2 others partially. And I don't mean one person from this generation and one person from that generation. I mean multiple people. And I'm sorry, but there are only so many people I can care about to this extent, especially when you're not spending enough time developing their stories. Especially when you combine that with my previous criticism, it doesn't give me the opportunity to get to know these people and care about them enough to carry the story. As such, the first third of the book was my favorite because it followed the characters that I cared about the most, and then the second third I was lukewarm about, and the last one I fully didn't care. And lastly, this is a very tough book to read. From the abuse of Koreans to the abuse of poor to the abuse of women, there is no end to the frustration one feels whilst reading this book. And while it's important to have these aspects of history represented and portrayed in an honest way, I believe in fiction it is equally important to offset that by some deeper meaning, because this is where the value of fiction lies. This is why it's important to read and write fiction as opposed to non-fiction. Let me try to explain. Non-fiction is meant to represent history and portray it as it was, at least as much as it's possible, because it's written by humans and humans are flawed and subjective. But in the general case, it is what it is. It is bleak and brutal and tragic. By reading it, we learn right from wrong, what not to do, and this is how we evolve as a society. Fiction, on the other hand, gives the author the ability to take the background of these tragic, terrible events and weave into them a story that can give them meaning on a personal level. It allows us to view suffering and tragedy in a different way and make sense of it. This is how we evolve as individuals. So when you have a story that follows such bleak historical reality and no deeper meaning to offset that, you're just left with the frustration. And no matter how historically accurate the book is, to me, it's borderline meaningless to read. So I gave the book 3 stars, mostly because of the first part and the nice historical setup, but I ultimately leave it disappointed. Jesus, this is right into my eyes. Hold on. Much better. Next, I read a book that wasn't even on my TBR, and that is Beautiful Demons by Sarra. This is a young adult urban fantasy and the first book in the Shadow Demon saga. The book is very short, less than 200 pages, I believe, and I read it kind of incidentally. You can watch it over here in my latest vlog if you're curious. I kind of enjoyed the book. I wouldn't call it a masterpiece by any stretch of the imagination. It is very short, very quick, but it kind of gave me Harry Potter for girls vibes in the beginning, and then it kind of switched to a different vibe, but I had a good time and I'm gonna continue with the series. I got it as an ebook for free from Amazon because the author offers it for free there. So if you're interested in a young adult, high school-y kind of fantasy romance thingy, this could be the book for you. I had a good time. I gave it 3 stars. See the difference in perception? Sometimes I will give the same ratings to 2 books but feel differently about them. It's very strange, and I think it's based mostly on expectations. Speaking of expectations, the next book I had very low expectations for and yet somehow got disappointed, and that book is The Atlas 6 by Olivie Blake. This is a very popular dark academia fantasy and the first book in the Atlas series, I believe. I absolutely detested this book and DNF'd it at about 50%. Why? For many reasons, but let me start with the one that I already expected, and that was the very pretentious and annoying writing style. I already read one book by Olivie Blake, and that was Alone with You in the Ether. I totally hated this book. You can watch a kind of reading experiment where I read it and talk about it alongside other popular romances. And the writing is no better here. Olivie Blake writes like I wrote in high school, all full of imaginary wit and ignorant revelations. It just sounds fake and annoying to read. And then on top of that, the book was boring. How can you make a book about the Library of Alexandria boring? I will never know. This is an achievement in and of itself. There was no atmosphere, no gripping mystery. Honestly, I'm losing my desire to live just thinking about this book. But the worst thing as ever are the empty and annoying characters. It's just a group of pompous fools who wouldn't stop bitching and moaning about the weight of all the magnificent gifts they were imbued with. Don't you just love it when a bunch of self-centered elitists who haven't had to cook a single meal on their own wax poetically about the woes of capitalism and oppression whilst benefiting from it and scrunching up their noses at anyone who isn't them because they're so much better. We have the unintentional irony of some of the most pretentious characters I've ever seen bemoaning high society whilst being the epitome of it. I swear, this woman manages to write some of the least relatable to me books ever. And I do believe this is gonna be the last book by this author I ever read, if I'm lucky. Next, I read a book that wasn't on my TBR and I really liked, and that is The Assassin's Blade by Sarra J. Maas. This is a young adult fantasy and the prequel to the Throne of Glass series. Now, Throne of Glass is rapidly becoming one of my favorite young adult series, kind of against all odds. Say what you want about Sarra J. Maas, the woman knows how to write addictive stories, and just when you think you have her all figured out, she goes in and sneaks some subtlety. This book is a collection of short stories that tell kind of the origin story of Selena before Throne of Glass started, and I gotta admit, she was kind of insufferable here, but considering that this is before her arc starts, it is kind of understandable. And by the end, we did see some hints of improvement. I am also kind of ashamed and happy to admit that this book made me cry. The last part was absolutely insane, and I'm gonna venture into some small spoilers here, so if you don't want to be spoiled, skip to that timestamp. The part where Selena was waiting for Sam to return, but he doesn't, and you know he won't, was masterfully done. This part absolutely killed me. I felt like I was the one who was waiting, and I have rarely experienced such visceral sorrow from a book before. Very well done. I really enjoyed this book. I gave it 4 stars. And by the way, I will recommend you read this after book number 3 in the series. Next, I read Abaddon's Gate by James S.A. Corey. This is an adult science fiction and the 3rd book in the Expanse series. This was another great entry in this series. The action, the science fiction, the characters, all of it was amazing. The setup. I am so excited to continue with this series. I swear to God, I feel like every next book is better and better, and I couldn't recommend it highly enough. Truly, it is a masterpiece so far. We had some very interesting ethical ponderings in this book, as well as some amazing action and some of the best sci-fi I have read in my life. If you're looking for a space opera set in the solar system that gets bigger and bigger with every single book, this is definitely the series for you. I gave it 4.5 stars. And the last book I finished in the month of November was The Subtle Art of Not Giving an F, a counterintuitive approach to living a good life by Mark Manson. This is a non-fiction book from the self-help variety, and it was very popular several years ago. I started reading it a while back, and now I came back and finished it, and to be honest with you, it was okay. I gave it 3 stars. It is kind of middle of the way for me. I can understand why it was so popular, but I find it a little bit surface level and kind of contradicting itself in the advice that it gives and in the way you should be looking at life. It kind of follows the Stoic philosophy, but oversimplifies it and is very shallow in my opinion. It's not a masterpiece, but it's an okay book, and if you're looking for something to pick you up and give you a different way to look at life, I guess I would recommend. I don't know. So to summarize the month of November, I read 9 books, which equate to 3,267 pages. I DNF'd 1 book. In terms of genres, I read 1 classic, 3 fantasies, 1 historical fiction, 1 manga, 1 mystery/thriller, 1 non-fiction, and 1 science fiction. In terms of formatting, I had 7 paperbacks, 1 hardback, and 1 ebook. And in terms of sourcing, I owned every single one of these books. Now, that's not a bad achievement, but those weren't the only books that I read in the month of November, because let me tell you, this is what I am currently still reading. We have No Middle Name by Lee Child, which is a collection of short stories in the Jack Reacher series. I got to this one because Without a Fail got me very much in the mood for it, so I started reading it. Then we have Fullmetal Alchemist Volume 7, which I also got in the mood for after finishing Fullmetal Alchemist Volume 6, so I started reading this one. Then we have The Dragon's Legacy. This is honestly the first book I started reading in November, and I am still not even halfway done with it because it's such a chore to read. If you want to learn more about it, watch my latest vlog. I talk about this a little bit more. I am going to continue reading it in the month of December because this is the book I chose for the Dragon Readathon I'm participating in, and I really want to finish it so that I can make my own dragon. Then we have Queen of Shadows by Sarra J. Maas, which is the fourth book in the Throne of Glass series, which I started reading after completing the Assassin's Quest, and this is a buddy read with a friend of mine. Both of us are loving this series. Nothing more I can say. I'm going to continue reading in the month of December. And then we have True Betrayals by Nora Roberts, which was the book for the Adventure in Eldia Readathon. I didn't technically finish it in the month of November, but I'm going to give myself some grace and try to finish it in the month of December. I don't want to fail a 12-month long challenge in the 11th month, so I'm going to continue reading it. It's not a bad book. It's just not necessarily for me, but I'm going to give it a chance and I'm going to push through. And then last, but definitely not least, I have East of the West by Miroslav Penkov. This is a collection of short stories written in Bulgarian. As you can see, it's also translated to English. It was part of my 2023 TBR. I really wanted to read it in the month of November, but I couldn't find it neither physically nor as an ebook anywhere, and I had to look for it in a secondhand stores, and I finally managed. It arrived today, by the way, and I just started reading it before I started filming this video, and that was a terrible mistake because I started bawling, like crying my eyes out. On the first page, I cried for like 45 minutes straight and had to redo my makeup, so that wasn't a great idea, but the book started amazingly and I am so excited to continue with it. And that is all for this wrap up. I'm assuming it's gonna end up being very long, but I hope you were at least mildly entertained. Please let me know what you read in the month of November. Have you read any of these books? Do you have any opinion on them? I am very curious to know. Drop a like if you have nothing better to do, and if you'd like to see some of my other wrap-ups and book reviews, check out this playlist. Bye!